You never expect the moment that saves your life to look ordinary. It doesn't come with warning lights. It doesn't arrive with dramatic music or a sudden crash of thunder. Most of the time, the moment that changes everything looks exactly like a small mistake. Something embarrassing, something forgettable. The kind of thing you laugh about later, or perhaps never mention at all. But every now and then, a small mistake opens a door. And behind that door is a truth so powerful, so unexpected, that it rearranges everything you thought you knew about your own life. This is the story of Margaret. A 72-year-old grandmother living in a small, quiet town in Oregon. A woman who believed her best days were finished. A woman who had slowly, quietly, almost invisibly, begun to disappear from her own life. And this is the story of a phone she almost didn't go back for. A phone that held messages she was never meant to read. Messages that would shatter every painful lie she had been telling herself for years. If you stay with this story until the very end, you may discover something that matters deeply to your own life. Because the truth that changed Margaret's life might be the same truth that someone listening to this right now desperately needs to hear. So let's begin. Let's go back to the beginning of Margaret's story. Not the beginning of her pain, but the beginning of her life. Because to understand how someone loses themselves, you first have to understand what they once had. Margaret grew up in a modest home in a Pacific Northwest town surrounded by pine forests and the constant, gentle sound of rain. She was the kind of woman who remembered birthdays, who kept homemade jam in her pantry, and who could make a stranger feel welcome in 30 seconds flat. She had a warmth that people noticed without being able to explain. You simply felt better when Margaret was in the room. She met Robert when they were both 24 years old at a community potluck dinner. He was not a man who stood out in a crowd. He was quiet, a little reserved, the kind of person who listened more than he spoke. But there was something steady about him, something dependable that Margaret recognized immediately. In a world full of noise, Robert was like solid ground. Their courtship was simple. Long walks. Sunday drives through the countryside. Conversations that stretched late into evenings. Robert was not wealthy. He worked a modest job at a local hardware store and later moved into carpentry. He didn't own expensive things or make grand promises about the future. But what he offered Margaret was something far rarer. He offered her his full and complete attention. When Margaret spoke, Robert listened. When she was sad, he sat beside her without trying to fix it. When she laughed, his whole face changed. He loved her with a quiet, consistent devotion that never needed applause. They married in a small ceremony on a Saturday afternoon in June. The reception was in someone's backyard. The food was homemade. The music came from a borrowed record player. And Margaret wore a simple white dress that she had spent 3 weeks sewing herself. It was, by most standards, an unremarkable wedding. But Margaret would tell you for the rest of her life that it was the happiest day she had ever known. Because she understood, even then, what she was choosing. She was not choosing grandeur. She was choosing love. Over the years, Robert showed that love in small, ordinary ways. He fixed things around the house without being asked. He left her favorite chocolate on the kitchen table after grocery shopping, not because it was her birthday or a special occasion, but simply because he had seen it on the shelf and thought of her. Every single morning, without a single exception, he walked into the backyard and carefully watered the rose garden that Margaret had planted in the first year of their marriage. Those roses became a symbol of something neither of them ever put into words. Margaret used to joke that Robert paid more attention to those roses than to anything else in the entire yard. And Robert would smile his quiet smile and say something she never forgot. Flowers need care to grow, Margaret. Just like love. They raised 2 children together. Emily, their eldest, was thoughtful and perceptive, the kind of child who asked questions that made adults uncomfortable with how insightful they were. Daniel, 3 years younger, was energetic and funny, always finding a way to make his mother laugh even on her most difficult days. Life was not without its hardships. There were years when money was tight. There were health scares, disagreements, difficult seasons. There was a miscarriage between Emily and Daniel that left Margaret silent for several weeks. There were job changes and house repairs and the ordinary endless battles of raising a family in the real world. But through all of it, Robert and Margaret faced everything together. Side by side. Never breaking formation. And by the time their children were grown and the house grew quieter, they had built something that very few people managed to build in a lifetime, a marriage that had grown stronger, not weaker, with every passing year. The morning Robert died was an ordinary Tuesday in February. The sky was the familiar gray of an Oregon winter. Rain tapped steadily on the roof. The coffee maker gurgled in the kitchen. Everything was exactly as it always was. Robert had woken early, as he always did. He had dressed in his usual way. He had walked into the kitchen to pour himself coffee. And then, without warning, without a single word, he collapsed. By the time the ambulance arrived, it was already too late. Margaret was 70 years old. She had been married for 46 years. She had spent nearly half a century sleeping next to the same man, building a life with him, navigating the world beside him. And in the space of a single ordinary Tuesday morning, all of that was simply gone. Grief, when it arrives at that scale, does not behave the way people expect. It does not always announce itself in floods of tears, though there were plenty of those. More often, in those first weeks, Margaret noticed it in the smallest things. The absence of the sound of Robert moving through the house in the early morning. The extra cup in the cabinet that no longer needed to come down. The rose garden waiting silently in the backyard. And the silence. Above everything else, the silence. Because when you have shared a home with someone for 46 years, their absence doesn't just leave emptiness. It leaves an echo. The house was full of sounds that Margaret associated with Robert, the particular way a floorboard creaked near his chair, the specific groan of the garage door when he came home, and now all of those sounds existed without him. Emily and Daniel were present in those early weeks. They came home, helped with arrangements, stayed as long as they could. They called regularly. They checked in. They expressed their concern in ways that were genuine and loving. But they also had their own lives. Their own families, their own responsibilities, their own grief to carry. And Margaret, being Margaret, did not want to add to their burden. So every time they asked how she was doing, she gave them the same answer. I'm fine. 2 words. Quiet. Practiced. Utterly unconvincing to anyone who looked closely, and yet somehow sufficient to keep the questions from going deeper. What happened to Margaret over the following 2 years was not dramatic. There was no single crisis, no moment of collapse, no event that could be pointed to and named. What happened was quieter, slower, and in many ways more dangerous than any visible catastrophe. Margaret simply began to withdraw. It started with small things. She stopped attending the monthly book club she had belonged to for 12 years. She told herself she was tired, that she wasn't in the mood, that she would go back next month. Next month never came. She stopped calling certain friends. Not because of any disagreement or falling out, simply because the energy required to maintain conversation, to perform wellness, to explain and navigate and deflect concern, had become too much. It was easier to let the phone sit. She stopped cooking the way she used to. Robert had always loved her cooking. She had spent decades making meals with care, with attention, with the quiet pleasure of feeding someone you love. Now she made simple things, quick things, things that required as little thought as possible. And the rose garden, Robert's roses, slowly began to fade. She still watered them, but irregularly, without the devotion Robert had brought to the task. The soil grew dry between waterings. Some branches began to thin. The blooms that appeared were fewer and less vibrant than they had once been. But none of these changes were the most dangerous part of what was happening to Margaret. The most dangerous part was happening inside her mind. Because as the silence in the house grew louder, and as the weeks stretched into months stretched into years, a story began to take shape in Margaret's thoughts. A story that felt completely true. A story that explained everything. A story that said, "You are no longer needed. The world has moved on without you. Your children have their own lives, their own families, their own futures, and you are not essential to any of them. You have already lived the important years. What remains is simply the waiting." This was the lie. And it was an extraordinarily convincing one. Because it didn't arrive with a villain's voice or obvious malice. It arrived gently, quietly, wrapped in the language of reason. It made itself at home inside Margaret's thoughts and stayed there, day after day, becoming more familiar and therefore more believable with every passing season. Margaret didn't recognize it as a lie. She experienced it as a conclusion. The natural, inevitable, logical conclusion of a life that had reached its culmination. And that is the most dangerous thing about the stories we tell ourselves. The most harmful ones are usually the ones that feel the most true. It was a rainy afternoon in October, the kind of deep, saturated Oregon rain that doesn't just fall but seems to wrap itself around everything, when Emily called. Margaret was sitting by the window of the living room. The book in her lap was open but she hadn't been reading it. She had been watching the raindrops slide down the glass, following their paths with her eyes, each one racing briefly toward the windowsill before disappearing. The house felt heavy that afternoon. Heavier than usual. As if the walls themselves were pressing inward. The phone buzzed on the side table and she picked it up. "Hi, Mom." Emily's voice was warm, the way it always was. They talked about small things first, the way people do when there's something more important underneath. The weather. A funny thing that had happened at work. A new restaurant Emily had tried. And then, carefully, Emily said, "Mom, we're having a family dinner tomorrow night. Jake and Lily have been asking about you. Daniel's going to be in town. It would really mean a lot to all of us if you came." Margaret's first instinct was to decline. She had become accustomed to declining. The social muscles that once made such invitations feel natural had weakened from disuse. The idea of sitting in a busy restaurant, of being among noise and movement and conversation after so many quiet months, felt overwhelming in a way that was difficult to explain. She hesitated. She started to form the familiar words. But Emily anticipated her. "Please come, Mom. Not just for us, for you, too. I think you need this. And honestly, we need it, too." There was something in Emily's voice that Margaret couldn't quite dismiss. Not desperation, not pressure. Something softer than that. Something that sounded, unmistakably, like love. Margaret said yes. She had no idea what that yes was about to lead to. The next evening, Margaret stood in front of the bathroom mirror getting ready. She had not dressed up to go out in a long time. She had forgotten, in a way, what it felt like to make an effort for the outside world. She looked at the woman in the mirror for a long moment. The gray hair that had once been dark. The lines around her eyes and mouth that mapped decades of expression, laughter, worry, love, grief. The slightly uncertain posture of someone who had grown and used to being looked at. For a moment, she barely recognized herself. Not because she looked old, she had always known she would grow old, had never been particularly vain about it, but because the woman looking back seemed somehow smaller than she remembered. As though she had been slowly diminishing, shrinking into herself, pulling inward like a flower at nightfall. But then, as she looked more carefully, she noticed something else. Behind the tired eyes. Behind the gray and the lines and the uncertainty. There was still someone there. Someone who had loved deeply and been loved deeply in return. Someone who had raised 2 children. Someone who had buried her husband and kept breathing. Someone who had survived 67 Oregon winters. Someone who had, in her time, been essential. She reached into the closet and found the soft blue sweater. She paused when she touched it. Robert used to say that color made her eyes shine. She hadn't worn it since before he died. She put it on. She picked up her purse. She stepped outside into the cool evening air. And she drove toward the restaurant, not knowing, not having any idea, that the most important hour of her recent life was waiting for her there. The restaurant glowed warmly through its windows. Margaret parked in the lot outside and sat in the car for a moment, watching the activity inside through the glass. Families at tables. Servers moving briskly. The particular kind of comfortable noise that only happens in places where people are at ease with each other. She took a long, slow breath. Then she got out of the car and walked toward the entrance. The door opened and a wave of warmth rushed to meet her, warmth and light and the smell of good food and the layered hum of conversation. And then she heard it. "Grandma." Jake came sprinting across the restaurant with all the uninhibited urgency that only 8-year-olds possess. He threw his arms around her waist and held on with the fierce, uncomplicated grip of someone who has no idea yet that affection is supposed to be restrained. Lily followed moments later, adding her arms to her brother's, and for a moment Margaret was simply wrapped in children, their warmth, their energy, their completely unconscious love. She laughed. A real laugh. The kind that comes from somewhere deep in the chest, the kind that surprises you with its own existence. Emily was already standing, smiling across the table. "Mom. You made it. You look beautiful." Daniel waved from the far side of the booth with the slightly awkward warmth of someone who expresses love more easily through action than words. "Hey, Mom. Good to see you." Margaret slid into the booth between her grandchildren, and for the first few minutes she mostly listened. Jake was in the middle of a complicated explanation about a science project involving magnets and something he called the invisible force. Lily was rehearsing arguments for why she should be cast as the lead in the upcoming school production. Daniel was complaining with theatrical despair about his deteriorating cooking skills in his wife's absence. And Margaret listened to all of it. She asked questions. She laughed at Daniel's description of his failed attempt to make pasta. She told Lily with complete sincerity that she would make a wonderful lead. She asked Jake 3 follow-up questions about his magnets project that made him look at her with surprised respect. And slowly, something began to happen. The weight she had been carrying for 2 years began, almost imperceptibly, to lift. Stories started to surface. Old ones. Stories about when Emily and Daniel were young and the world was small and full. A camping trip where it rained the entire 4 days and Robert refused to admit defeat. The year they tried to grow tomatoes and ended up with exactly 3. The time Robert attempted to repair the washing machine himself and instead flooded the entire laundry room in spectacular fashion. The table laughed. Even the stories they had heard before seemed new tonight, seemed brighter and more alive in this particular air. Emily watched her mother carefully all evening. She had been watching Margaret for over a year, tracking with quiet, worried precision the gradual fading she had observed in her phone calls, in her pauses, in the way she sometimes seemed to be somewhere else entirely even when she was present. Emily had been worried in the specific, helpless way that adult children worry about aging parents, uncertain how to help, uncertain how much to push, uncertain where the line was between support and intrusion. But tonight was different. Tonight Margaret was here. Fully, completely, undeniably here. The evening passed with the particular speed that good evenings always do. Plates emptied. The restaurant grew quieter as other families finished and left. And eventually, the night that had begun with a reluctant yes arrived at its warm and natural end. Jake hugged Margaret at the door with the same fierce grip he had greeted her with. "Grandma, you have to come to my science fair. It's next month. Promise me." "And my play," Lily added quickly, slipping her hand into Margaret's. "If I get the part." Margaret looked at both of them. At their bright, expectant faces, completely open, completely unguarded in the way that children are before the world teaches them caution. "I wouldn't miss either of them," she said. And she meant it. Margaret drove home through the quiet Oregon streets feeling something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Something that was difficult to name precisely. Not happiness exactly, though it included that. Not relief, though there was some of that too. Connection. That was the closest word. The sense of having been genuinely, fully present with people who mattered, of having given something and received something in return, of being part of something larger than the quiet walls of her house. And then, halfway home, she noticed. Her phone was not in her purse. She pulled over briefly and checked again. She looked in the side pockets, the main pocket, the small interior zip compartment she always forgot existed. Nothing. She must have left it in the booth. For a moment she considered leaving it. She could call the restaurant from the house phone, have them hold it, pick it up tomorrow. It was late. She was tired. The warm feeling of the evening was still with her and she didn't want to disrupt it with an errand. But something inside her said to go back. A small, insistent feeling with no particular logic behind it. Just a quiet certainty that felt like, though she would never have described it this way, a gentle hand on the shoulder, turning her around. She turned the car around. 10 minutes later she pulled back into the restaurant parking lot. The lights inside were dimmer now. Most of the tables were empty. A few last customers sat finishing their meals. She pushed open the door and a young waitress near the counter looked up with a polite, practiced smile. "Hi there. Can I help you?" "I think I left my phone here earlier," Margaret said. "I was sitting in that booth near the window, with my family." The waitress walked over to the booth. And sure enough, there it was, Margaret's phone, lying face down on the seat where she had left it. But when the waitress picked it up, the screen lit with a notification. Then another. Then another. The waitress glanced at the screen and then back at Margaret with a slightly uncertain expression. "Ma'am, I hope you don't mind me mentioning this. It's been lighting up since you left." Margaret took the phone gently. The screen showed notifications from a group chat. Her family's group chat, the one with Emily's name at the top, the one she checked every day. She unlocked it and opened the thread. And what she found there was a conversation she was never meant to see. The first message was from Emily. Sent less than an hour ago, while Margaret was driving home. It said, "Tonight made me really happy. Mom looked happier than she has in months." Margaret read it once. Then again. Then a third time, as if she needed the repetition to believe it. Happier than she has in months. She stared at those words. She turned them over in her mind. Because what they implied was something she had not allowed herself to consider, that her family had been watching her. That they had noticed her unhappiness. That it had registered, that it had been felt, that it had mattered to them. She scrolled down. Daniel had replied, "Yeah. I noticed that too. I've been worried about her." The word landed on Margaret like something physical. Worried. They had been worried about her. Not indifferent. Not oblivious. Not too busy with their own lives to notice. Worried. She kept reading. Emily again, "I think she's been really lonely since Dad passed. I wish we could spend more time with her." Margaret pressed her lips together. For 2 years she had been telling herself a story. The story said, "They are busy, they have moved on, you don't want to be a burden, they have their own lives to live." The story had felt reasonable. It had felt mature and selfless and clear-eyed. But the messages on the screen were dismantling that story sentence by sentence. Daniel again, "We need to make more time. She means everything to us. Everything." Margaret's hands were trembling now. She could feel it, the fine, insistent trembling of someone receiving information that contradicts something they have believed for a very long time. The body sometimes responds to emotional truth the same way it responds to cold. Another message. This one from Lily. She had typed it from Emily's phone, the way she sometimes did. "I love Grandma so much. I hope she knows that." Margaret covered her mouth with her hand. Her eyes filled. Because she had not known that. Not fully. Not in the way that reaches all the way down past rational knowledge into the deep, wordless place where we actually feel the reality of being loved. She had known it abstractly, the way you know something that you cannot quite let yourself believe. But these words, simple, unguarded, typed into a family chat that was never supposed to appear before her, these words bypassed all of that. They went straight through. Jake had added, "Grandma tells the best stories. Dinner is always better when she's there." And then Emily, once more, "I'm going to start bringing the kids over every Sunday. I think Mom needs that." To which Daniel had replied, "Not just her. We need it too." Margaret lowered the phone. She stood in the middle of the nearly empty restaurant with the quiet sound of distant kitchen noise around her and the gentle buzz of the overhead lights and the fading smell of someone else's dinner, and she wept. Not dramatically. Not loudly. Quietly, the way people cry when they are not performing grief for anyone but simply experiencing it, or in this case, experiencing its opposite. Something too large and too sudden and too important to pass through the chest without leaking from the eyes. The young waitress had been watching from a respectful distance. She had seen people read difficult messages before, bad news, surprises, arguments conducted through screens. She was practiced at the particular art of being present without intruding. But this looked different. This older woman in the blue sweater, standing at the edge of a table in her dimming restaurant, crying quietly over her phone, this felt like something important. Something that deserved witness. The waitress pulled out the chair across from where Margaret stood. "Are you okay?" Margaret looked up. Her eyes were wet, but there was something new in them. Something alive that had not been there when she first walked in. "I didn't know," Margaret said softly. "Didn't know what?" Margaret looked down at the phone in her hand. Then she looked back up at this stranger who was looking at her with open, uncomplicated kindness. I thought my family had moved on. I thought they didn't need me anymore. I thought I had become invisible to them somehow. Like a piece of furniture in a house they no longer paid attention to." The waitress sat down in the chair she had pulled out. She didn't say anything immediately. She simply looked at Margaret with the attentive patience of someone who understands that some things need to be said before they can be responded to. "And the phone," she said finally. "Messages," Margaret said. "From my daughter, my son, my grandchildren. They were talking about tonight. About me. They said," her voice caught slightly. "They said I matter to them. That they've been worried about me. That they love me." "Those sound like pretty important messages to find," the waitress said quietly. "I almost didn't come back for the phone," Margaret said. "I was going to leave it until tomorrow." The waitress absorbed this for a moment. "But you came back." "Something told me to." They sat together in silence for a moment. Two strangers in a dimming restaurant, sharing the particular intimacy that sometimes arises between people who will probably never see each other again but who have, in this single unexpected moment, been genuinely present with each other. Then Margaret said something she had never said out loud before. Something she had barely allowed herself to think. "I almost gave up this year." The waitress went still. Not dramatically, Margaret continued softly, her hands folded on the table. "Nothing like that. Just, quietly. I started to think my life had already happened. That the important part was finished. That what was left was just, waiting. Getting up and going to bed and waiting." Her voice was calm. Not distressed. Simply honest, with the particular honesty of someone who has never put a thing into words before and is discovering, in the saying of it, how true it has been. "It sounds like tonight interrupted that," the waitress said carefully. Margaret looked at the phone in her hand. At the glowing screen with its evidence of people who loved her, who had been thinking of her, who had spoken her name in the warm aftermath of an evening that had meant something. "Yes," she said simply. "It did." Another notification appeared as she watched. "Emily again. Next time Mom comes over, I'm going to tell her how much we love having her around." Margaret read it. She read it again. And then she did something she hadn't done in a very long time. She smiled, not the polite, practiced smile she used during obligatory phone calls. Not the smile of someone managing an impression. But the real one. The one that starts somewhere deeper. She looked at the waitress across the table. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" "I just picked up your phone." Margaret thought for a moment. "For letting me see something I needed to see. For sitting with me while I saw it." The young waitress had been watching from a respectful distance. She had seen people read difficult messages before, bad news, surprises, arguments conducted through screens. She was practiced at the particular art of being present without intruding. But this looked different. This older woman in the blue sweater, standing at the edge of a table in her dimming restaurant, crying quietly over her phone, this felt like something important. Something that deserved witness. The waitress pulled out the chair across from where Margaret stood. "Are you okay?" Margaret looked up. Her eyes were wet, but there was something new in them. Something alive that had not been there when she first walked in. "I didn't know," Margaret said softly. "Didn't know what?" Margaret looked down at the phone in her hand. Then she looked back up at this stranger who was looking at her with open, uncomplicated kindness. I thought my family had moved on. I thought they didn't need me anymore. I thought I had become invisible to them somehow. Like a piece of furniture in a house they no longer paid attention to." The waitress sat down in the chair she had pulled out. She didn't say anything immediately. She simply looked at Margaret with the attentive patience of someone who understands that some things need to be said before they can be responded to. "And the phone," she said finally. "Messages," Margaret said. "From my daughter, my son, my grandchildren. They were talking about tonight. About me. They said," her voice caught slightly. "They said I matter to them. That they've been worried about me. That they love me." "Those sound like pretty important messages to find," the waitress said quietly. "I almost didn't come back for the phone," Margaret said. "I was going to leave it until tomorrow." The waitress absorbed this for a moment. "But you came back." "Something told me to." They sat together in silence for a moment. Two strangers in a dimming restaurant, sharing the particular intimacy that sometimes arises between people who will probably never see each other again but who have, in this single unexpected moment, been genuinely present with each other. Then Margaret said something she had never said out loud before. Something she had barely allowed herself to think. "I almost gave up this year." The waitress went still. Not dramatically, Margaret continued softly, her hands folded on the table. "Nothing like that. Just, quietly. I started to think my life had already happened. That the important part was finished. That what was left was just, waiting. Getting up and going to bed and waiting." Her voice was calm. Not distressed. Simply honest, with the particular honesty of someone who has never put a thing into words before and is discovering, in the saying of it, how true it has been. "It sounds like tonight interrupted that," the waitress said carefully. Margaret looked at the phone in her hand. At the glowing screen with its evidence of people who loved her, who had been thinking of her, who had spoken her name in the warm aftermath of an evening that had meant something. "Yes," she said simply. "It did." Another notification appeared as she watched. "Emily again. Next time Mom comes over, I'm going to tell her how much we love having her around." Margaret read it. She read it again. And then she did something she hadn't done in a very long time. She smiled, not the polite, practiced smile she used during obligatory phone calls. Not the smile of someone managing an impression. But the real one. The one that starts somewhere deeper. She looked at the waitress across the table. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" "I just picked up your phone." Margaret thought for a moment. "For letting me see something I needed to see. For sitting with me while I saw it." Margaret walked out of the restaurant into the cool night air. The parking lot was nearly empty now. A light mist had begun to fall, the way it does in October in Oregon, gentle and persistent. She stood for a moment outside the entrance, her phone carefully in her purse, her breath making small clouds in the cold air. Something had shifted. She could feel it in the way the night looked different, not literally, not physically, the same streetlights and wet pavement and dark trees at the edge of the parking lot, but different in the way that the world sometimes looks different when you are experiencing it from a different place inside yourself. For 2 years she had been walking through this town, driving these streets, seeing these same familiar sights, while carrying a weight she had not named. The weight of believing herself unnecessary. Of experiencing every passing day as further confirmation of a lie she had accepted as truth. And now, in the space of an evening and a forgotten phone, that lie had been broken. Not healed entirely. These things are never that simple. But broken. Cracked open, at least, in a way that let light through. She got into the car and drove home slowly. The town was asleep. Street lights made orange reflections on the wet road. The familiar houses passed one by one. And Margaret thought about her family. About Emily's careful attention all evening. About Daniel's comfortable laugh. About Lily's hand slipping into hers. About Jake, who had asked her to come to his science fair with the complete confidence of someone who has no reason to doubt that the people he loves will show up. She thought about what they had written in that group chat. The private, uncensored things they had said when they thought no one outside the family was watching. And she understood something that felt both obvious and completely new. The distance she had felt between herself and her family had not been built by their indifference. It had been built by her silence. By the practiced "I'm fine" that ended conversations before they could go deeper. By the withdrawn invitations, the missed gatherings, the gradual disappearance of the woman her family was still looking for. She had not been forgotten. She had been mourned. And there was a difference, a profound and important difference, between those two things. Margaret pulled into her driveway and turned off the engine. She sat for a moment in the silence of the car, not quite ready to go inside yet. The porch light glowed over the front door. The familiar lines of the house were the same as always. The window near the kitchen where Robert used to stand with his morning coffee. She went inside. She set her purse on the table. She made a small cup of chamomile tea and carried it to the living room. And this time, the silence did not feel like wait. It felt like space. The difference between a room that is empty and a room that is waiting. She sat for a while. She looked at Robert's chair near the window. She thought about him, not with the sharp, fresh grief of the early days, but with something softer. Something like gratitude. Because the love he had given her, the decades of steady, quiet, consistent devotion, had not disappeared with him. It had become part of her. It lived in how her children loved their own children. In how her grandchildren ran to her across a restaurant without hesitation. In the rose garden waiting outside. She went to bed and slept properly for the first time in months. The next morning, she woke earlier than usual. Something had changed in the quality of her waking. She did not surface slowly into heaviness the way she had become accustomed to, but rose cleanly, with a sense that the day ahead had something in it worth meeting. She made coffee. She walked to the kitchen window and looked out at the backyard. The rose garden. She looked at it for a long time. The dry soil. The thinning branches. The scattered leaves. The plants that were still alive, still fundamentally alive, but that had been quietly suffering from lack of care. She thought about what Robert used to say. About flowers needing care to grow. About love being the same. And she thought about herself. About the 2 years she had spent slowly withdrawing from everything that fed her, from connection, from family, from presence, from purpose. About how she had, in her grief and loneliness, done to her own life exactly what she had done to those roses. She had stopped watering it. She set down her coffee. She went to the shed and got the garden hose. And she walked back to the roses. The morning air was cool and smelled of earth and rain. Birds were beginning in the trees at the far edge of the yard. The town was waking up around her in its quiet way. And Margaret knelt down in the damp grass beside the rose beds and turned on the water. The stream spread slowly across the dry soil, darkening it, soaking in, reaching toward the roots. And something happened that is difficult to describe precisely, because it was internal, because it was real only to her, because it existed in the space where emotion and meaning intersect. Margaret felt something return. Not all at once. Not dramatically. But steadily, like water soaking into dry ground. A sense of purpose. A sense of presence. A sense that she was here, that being here mattered, that the act of caring for something, for flowers, for family, for her own life, was not something that ended at a certain age or a certain loss. It was simply something that required attention. Every single day. The changes that followed were not dramatic. They were quiet and steady, the way most real changes are. Margaret began calling her grandchildren more often. Not to report or to check in or to fulfill an obligation, but simply to talk. To hear about Jake's Magnets project and Lily's audition anxiety and the particular urgent concerns of children who are navigating a world that is still new to them. She discovered that she loved these conversations in a way she had not expected, that listening to young people talk about their lives returned something to her that she had not known was missing. She went to Jake's science fair the following month. He spotted her in the crowd from across the gymnasium, and his face did the thing that children's faces do when someone they love appears unexpectedly in a place that matters to them. Margaret carried the memory of that expression with her for months. Lily got the part in the school play. Margaret sat in the front row on opening night, and she clapped until her hands hurt, and she didn't care even slightly. Emily began bringing the children over on Sunday afternoons, as she had promised in the group chat. At first just occasional Sundays, then most Sundays, then Sundays that had the settled feeling of a genuine tradition. The house that had been too quiet filled with voices and footsteps and the particular productive chaos of children who feel at home somewhere. Daniel started calling more. Not perfectly, not every week, he was imperfect, as people are, but noticeably more. And when he called he asked real questions and stayed on the line long enough to hear real answers. Margaret rejoined the book club. She went back once out of obligation and then kept going because she had forgotten how much she enjoyed arguing about novels with people who cared about them. She had forgotten that she was, in fact, interesting. That she had opinions worth hearing. That her presence in a room changed it in ways she could not always see but that were real. And the rose garden bloomed again. Slowly, with patience, with the incremental beauty of things that are properly cared for. By the following spring it was fuller than it had been in 2 years, red and pink petals in the morning light, the smell of them drifting through the kitchen window when she left it open. One afternoon Margaret stood in the backyard looking at those roses in bloom. The sun was low and warm. The garden was beautiful. And she thought, for the 100th time since October, about everything that had led to this moment. A dinner invitation she almost declined. A phone she almost left behind. A simple decision to turn the car around. Messages she was never supposed to see. The smallest possible sequence of events. And yet every one of them had mattered. Every one of them had been a door, and she had, almost without meaning to, kept walking through. There is a particular kind of lie that is more dangerous than the obvious ones. More dangerous than the lies we tell other people. It is the lie we tell ourselves. The story we construct out of silence and fear and the absence of evidence to the contrary. The story that fills in the blank spaces with our worst fears instead of with truth. For Margaret, that story said, "You are forgotten. You are unnecessary. The world has moved on, your children have moved on, your most important years are behind you. You are simply waiting now." This story was a lie. But it was a lie that wore the convincing costume of logic, of selflessness, of clear-eyed realism. It presented itself as wisdom rather than as fear. And in the silence of a quiet house over 2 long years, it had grown very loud. What the messages on that phone revealed was not simply that her family loved her. Margaret had known that in some abstract, intellectual way. What the messages revealed was the gap between knowing something and allowing yourself to feel it. Between understanding that love exists and permitting yourself to receive it. And what watering those roses the next morning revealed was something equally important, that connection is not something that simply exists or doesn't exist. It is something that requires maintenance. It requires showing up. It requires the daily, ordinary, unglamorous act of reaching out, staying present, and continuing to invest in the things that matter. Margaret had, in her grief, stopped doing that. She had stopped reaching out, stopped showing up, stopped investing. And the inevitable result was exactly what she experienced, a growing sense of disconnection, of irrelevance, of invisible distance. But the distance was not their indifference. It was the natural consequence of withdrawal. And the solution was not dramatic. It was not a single grand gesture or an emotional confrontation or a formal declaration of recommitment. It was a dinner invitation accepted. A science fair attended. A phone call made. Sunday afternoons honored. It was, in the end, just showing up. If you have listened to this story, if you have stayed with Margaret from the beginning to this final moment in her blooming garden, then perhaps you have recognized something. Perhaps somewhere in her story you have seen a reflection of something in your own life. Perhaps you know what it feels like to tell yourself a story about your own invisibility. Perhaps you know the particular loneliness of believing that the people you love have moved on, that you no longer occupy space in their lives the way you once did. Perhaps you know what it is to mistake the silence of others for indifference, when in truth that silence might be full of things they have not yet found the words to say. If any of that is true for you, then consider this. The story you are telling yourself might not be the whole story. The messages might be waiting. Not necessarily on a phone in a restaurant booth, though such things do happen. But in the form of a conversation not yet had, a visit not yet made, a call not yet returned, an invitation not yet extended. In the form of the small actions that, taken together, constitute the ongoing maintenance of love between people. You do not have to wait for a forgotten phone to deliver the truth to you. You can simply, today, tomorrow, this week, turn toward the people who matter to you. Call without a reason. Show up without an occasion. Say the things that feel too obvious to say, because the most important truths are always the ones we assume everyone already knows. And if you are the Emily in someone's life, if you are the adult child or the friend or the sibling who has noticed a quiet withdrawal in someone you love, then do not wait for them to find the phone. Be the phone. Say the things directly. Don't just feel them in a group chat. Say them out loud, to the person who needs to hear. Margaret's roses bloom again every spring. Her grandchildren know the names of the different varieties. Her kitchen fills with voices on Sunday afternoons. The empty chair by the window is still Robert's, and she still misses him every single day. That kind of love does not end, and it should not, and the missing of it is part of what it means to have had something real. But Margaret is not waiting anymore. She is living. She is present. She is still writing the story. And somewhere in Oregon, if you listen carefully on a still morning, you might just catch the sound of water moving through a garden hose and the smell of roses coming through an open window. Small sounds. Ordinary sounds. The sounds of a life, tended with care, continuing to grow. Thank you for listening. Your story is still being written. And the most important chapters, the ones full of presence and connection and the small ordinary courage of showing up, may still be ahead of you. Take care of the people you love. And never stop watering the garden.